session of stuff that we've been going over for the past couple of weeks: realism, liberalism, institutionalism, and sort of judging from your comments online. The one thing that I have seen many of you sort of moving towards at this stage of the game is, number one, you're having difficulty trying to figure out whether you are a realist or whether you're a liberalist. Okay? And there's pros and cons to each, right? The realists have certain arguments that just, are constantly going to be there, but the liberalists also have points that, indicate that we can progress over time. And the thing that I would usually like to do as we're sort of wrapping up the theoretical section of this class is to find out how much of these theories really work in reality. You look at current events, which we will be doing today and Wednesday. I want to apply a little bit more, topics and issues that we're discussing, and it's a bit difficult, I think, to really pigeonhole one event within one theoretical construct. And that's not really all that problematic. I mean, first of all, when we observe the world, we can't just simply empiricize the way that theoreticians want us to do. Okay? Poli-sci is, as much as some people in my department hate to admit it, they are part of a larger family of social scientists. Even though some of the more quantitative political scientists out there feel that all we need is more rigorous analysis, more game theory models, more statistical analysis. I mean, you open up the newspaper, you see what's going on in Syria, you see what's going on in Ukraine, you look at the refugee crisis coming into Europe, you gotta ask yourself, how many regression models do you really need to kind of state the painfully obvious? You look at what's happening in Syria today, and you wonder whether or not security studies can properly assess what the future is going to hold for this country. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, Russia comes in and is like, I'm going to now bomb parts of the country, And, the United States is sort of like saying, hey, you can't do that. You can't violate Syria's sovereignty. To which Russia would respond, why? You do it all the time, right? And so the point here is that real world events kind of work outside of theory. And more often than not, okay, when we're trying to examine, what's going on in the world, okay, observation and experimentation. Observation about what actually happens, experimentation of what we think should happen, more often than not, does not coincide, okay? So the theories that we stand behind may not always tell us the whole story. They might get us somewhere. They might help us explain some things, but there's a lot of stuff that we have to take on faith. There's a lot of stuff that happens just by chance. And one other, major issue is that global leaders, whether you're presidents or prime ministers or kings or Führers or whatever it is, I mean, these people, when they enter into the world stage, they largely shape events according to their own design, which is something that doesn't really fit nicely or easily into either of these theories. But it's worth going over again. What are some of the major points? And at this stage of the game, if you've been paying attention, which I have overwhelming evidence to suggest that you do, you'd understand that realism, stuff that we've been talking about pretty much since day one, right, rests on the following principles. Right? Consider this your first general review for the midterm. Right? Realism, power, and security. Right? That's what it's all based on. That's what it all begins with. That's what it all rests upon. Power and security. An interdependent, mutually reinforcing set of variables. Power gives states the ability to enhance its security. An enhanced security network backs up, reinforces, ensures one's power. Okay? So the two are mutually exclusive. One does not necessarily produce the other. The second thing that we have to understand about realism, and this has pretty much dominated the field up until now, states are and will remain the primary actors. Now, this is somewhat in realism's favor. Now, when you look at what's happening in the world today, again, refugee crisis in Europe, Syrian civil war, Ukrainian sovereignty, just to name three things. When was the last time anybody ever said, thank goodness the UN came in? Right? When was the last time? You do, of course, know that last week the UN General Assembly was meeting for its annual little powwow. Right? And Obama was there to give a talk, and Putin was there to give a talk, and various heads of states from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe shows up. Were we really paying attention? Or were these speeches just largely there for the cameras? As far as the UN General Secretary is concerned, I have no evidence to believe that Ban Ki-moon is not an honorable man. I have no reason to suggest that Ban Ki-moon is a bad person, but the general understanding is that if you are General Secretary of the United Nations, you really don't have a lot of authority. You may have some influence and authority, you might have some moral authority. The United Nations has, if it has any authority at all, it has the authority of a high school hall monitor. You know? Hey, walk, don't run. You know? Type of thing. Oh, if there's a war, we'll blow a whistle and a real army will come in and, save the day. You know? I mean, the United Nations is something that every country sort of vests some interest in. Make no mistake about it. Right? The United Nations does have its role, but the United Nations is a toothless institution. And so the realists will point to that and say institutions matter only insofar as the states give them the power to do so. And whether it's the UN, the European Union, NATO, whatever it is that you want to call it, states are and will remain the primary actors. They're the ones that have access to militaries, access to industry, access to legitimate authority. And until there is an international institution that bases its authority from the consent of some electorate, the state will remain the final authoritative arbiter. They may need institutions in order to get certain things done. But at the end of the day, let's be perfectly honest. What is going to stop the killing in Syria? The United Nations or a sovereign state? Or better yet, who is going to be more responsible for either stopping the killing or perpetuating the killing? The United Nations or a sovereign state? Usually it's the latter. So in that understanding, okay, the national interest, states as principal actors, will continue to dominate the international arena. And if states are the primary actors, realists argue, states act out of national interest, right? What do I get out of this? That's ultimately what a state will ask within the realist paradigm. What do I get out of acting, getting involved, or staying at home? If I can get more out of doing something than not doing something, if it's in my interest, then I'll do it. If it's going to be nothing but costly, if it's going to be irrelevant, well then why bother? So states will act in the name of national interest. And national interest is almost always tied up with national security. Right? If my security can be enhanced, expanded, if my power can be enhanced, expanded, then it is my national interest to do so. Civil liberties are, for the most part, a feature on a more advanced model car. For realism, at least classical realism, political rights, civil liberties, that's like moon roofs and XM radio and car warmers and car seat warmers, right? The car's still going to get you from point A to point B. You don't really care about these extra features, okay? If you're a democracy, great. If you're authoritarian, who cares? As long as either one of those two ideologies preserves your security, Bob's your uncle, okay? In that situation, oh, I need to switch this. The gains are mostly considered absolute. Apologies for this. It should be absolute gains, not relative gains. Absolute gains, as far as the realist paradigm is concerned, is that one state's advantage over another is a direct 1-1 relationship. My advantage is your disadvantage. Your weakness could potentially be my strength. Okay? So absolute gains, not relative gains. I have to switch that. Realists also abide by the understanding of balance of power. For a theory that's pretty pessimistic, it's not the most belligerent. Realism's main goal is to perpetuate the status quo. The status quo may not be ideal, but nothing ever is. When we talk about balance of power, we are effectively understanding a series of alliances and agreements that smaller states will make as a way of balancing out, nullifying the hegemonic power of a larger state. So balance of power, which can mostly be wrapped up in the European history of basically 1815 to 1915, sort of like the 100-year period, from roughly the defeat of Napoleon to Bang Bang Sarajevo, what we would call the Concert of Europe. It was an intricate alliance system among 4 or 5 European powers: Great Britain, France, Austria, Russia, and depending upon where they were on the map, Italy and or Germany. Okay? And it usually meant, 2 countries allying against 3 others or something like that, right? But the point was to provide some kind of power equilibrium across the field that made it difficult, if not instrumentally costly, for any one of these powers to go to war to enhance its own prestige. The balance of power keeps everything effectively under order. It doesn't guarantee peace, but it does at least try to guarantee stability. And as far as ideology is concerned, leave that at home. Leave ideology at home, argues the more orthodox realists. Ideology only gets people into trouble, because ideology is something that will make you a little bit more zealous in expanding your interests around the world. Ideology be damned. Everybody's got an ideology. Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody's got their own spin on truth. This is probably one of the more objective sides of realism. Realism says ideology should not be used as an instrument of foreign policy because it gets your emotional heartstrings going. Okay? Oh, look, people over there are suffering. Well, hey, you know what? The laws of nature basically say that everybody suffers at some point. Okay? So, are you going to expend your time, energy, and resources to go help out over there? What does it cost you? What does it gain you? If it gains you something, okay. But if it risks your own security, you know what? Change the channel. Look elsewhere. Because the other problem is this. You don't want to risk being hypocritical in the realist world. If you decide to get really sympathetic about something happening over there, you sure as hell better make certain that you then apply it everywhere around the map, lest you be pointed out for engaging in selective diplomacy. The minute you're accused of selective diplomacy, oh, you care about that, but you don't care about that, no one's going to take you seriously. An interesting point. Most of the realists were against George Bush Jr.'s neoconservative foreign policy strategy in the Middle East 10 plus years ago. Right? The Mearsheimers, the Huntingtons, the Ken Waltzes were all against regime change in Iraq 2003. One of the arguments was that Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Afghanistan's a different story. Afghanistan was harboring Al-Qaeda. But removing Saddam, nobody was going to argue that Saddam was a great guy. But they were going to say that getting involved in regime change is a very long, very costly, very drawn-out affair. That the United States is just not interested in footing the bill. You engage in regime change, you are going to have to be as proactive as you were in Berlin, 1945, and Tokyo, 1945. You own the territory. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to effectively foot the bill for Iraqi security for 45 years, just as you did for West Germany? Are you willing to effectively own Japan for at least 5 to 10 years? Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to make the sacrifices? Because if you're not, then it's best to leave what's-his-nuts in power. Because if you don't, if you take him out, and you do this on the cheap, you actually run the risk of furthering instability, not guaranteeing stability. You actually honestly make things worse. The realists were correct. Surprisingly, the realists were correct about regime change in Iraq, and most of them today are against entanglements as far as Syria is concerned. Same argument. I'm not really shedding a tear for Bashar al-Assad. But given the options that Syria has right now, and they are all some degree of shitty, given the options, it is actually best to keep him in power. Because the opposition, we don't know what they're going to do. We have no idea what their capabilities are. They have yet to be tested as far as running a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional state. And getting rid of him effectively means a power vacuum for ISIS. And nobody wants these guys in power. So the realists, surprisingly enough, are against this whole notion of going in with the, guns and glory and changing things in the name of free democracy. So in that case, the realists are somewhat right. But yet, the realists have a lot of weaknesses as well. For all of their advantages, surprisingly enough, realists also have weak predictive capabilities. Nobody predicted the end of the Cold War. Nobody predicted that Gorbachev, there's one charismatic individual, would issue the order at the end of the 1980s to stop supporting all of these communist satellite states in Eastern Europe. East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria. Gorbachev basically tells all of their puppet leaders, you're on your own. You can find a way of surviving, great. If you don't, well, you should have reformed better. Of course, Gorbachev gets sucked into the whirlwind as well. Nobody was able to predict that. Nobody was able to predict how the Cuban Missile Crisis would have ended. Kennedy, stood down Khrushchev and forced Khrushchev to blink. Good for him. But that is one heck of a risk to take. Ask your parents or your grandparents where they were and what they thought about Cuban Missile Crisis. We were not only about a spit throw away from World War III, we were a spit throw away from a nuclear war. Nuclear war. Okay? Realism also has little regard for historical sequencing. Realists think that same thing happens over and over again. It's a 20 to 30-year cycle. That's about it. Multipolar world, bipolar world, unipolar world, multipolar world, bipolar, uni. Oh, we'll change off a little bit. Bipolar again. Right? That's about it. Not much else changes. Realism is going to say that we are still in this cycle of violence, still in this cycle of unpredictability. Okay, that's all fine and good. But explain to me why there are large pockets of the world today that are not only stable, but peaceful. Peaceful and cooperative. That's because realists give little regard to institutions. Initially, the realists were like, look at that thing, it's so fucking cute. And we'll call that the League of Nations. Oh, aren't you so cute? Look at the little League of Nations. Aww, right? Realists today are a little bit more, okay, we've accepted that institutions exist. But realists, for the most part, kind of regard institutions, if at the absolute best, as just ways in which I can get more shit for myself. All right, that's about it. They don't really understand that, as bureaucratically inept as the UN can be, a lot of people in the world do believe in it. A lot of people do believe in it. Number two, the European Union may be a bureaucratic behemoth. It may very well be Germany's latest attempt at taking over Europe. And trust me, they're pretty adamant that if they do this, this will be the third time in 100 years that Germany has tried to take over Europe. Okay, and this time around, they're actually following Bismarck's model much better. The European Union doesn't bother with Russia. If England wants to go, go. And if you got that, Germany can take over the continent. Yay, they don't use a military. They just have bankers and creditors. That's about it. Okay? But you know what? As much as I like to make fun of the European Union as the most boring empire in history, the European Union has done phenomenal accomplishments in interconnecting economies, interconnecting communication, interconnecting road work. It's kind of funny how all of this is suddenly becoming unraveled at the sight of 5,000 Syrians, but still, right, in a perfect world, right, this stuff is working. When was the last time you had to worry about a war breaking out on the European continent that wasn't in the Balkans? If your answer was more than 50 years ago, you can thank the European Union for that. Okay? Realism also relies too much on states as top-down actors. Even today, in the age of communication and globalization, realism still regards states as the authority that speaks on behalf of the entire people. And we're living in an age of non-governmental organizations. We're living in an age of social media. We're living in an age of Skype, for God's sake. We're living in an age where our leaders can say something and immediately Facebook, Twitter will respond by saying, wow, that was really stupid. Okay? It doesn't remove the person from power, but it certainly shows you that, hey guys, guess what? Not everybody marches in lockstep with those people that speak on behalf of our government. Half the people in this country think Obama's the Antichrist. Okay, the minute Obama says something, it's like it's National Kitten Day, whatever. Oh, Obama, he was whatever, fuck him, whatever. I mean, you know that there are people, you have a family member that sends out those mass emails that's absolutely convinced that Obama is a member of the crab people. Okay? As weird and as funny as they are, you're going to have to deal with at least one of them in a month at the Thanksgiving table. You always got one. Okay? But it shows you something. It shows that the public today is more inclined to voice their opinions, whether or not they agree with national leaders. Surprisingly, realism also has little regard for human dynamics. The fact that people can improve, that people can learn from their past mistakes. League of Nations is, again, you're adorable. But the thing is that the League of Nations, God bless it, the League of Nations, at least as far as Woodrow Wilson was concerned, well, we're going to talk about this after the midterm, was an attempt at trying to break the cycle of violence after World War I, which shows at the absolute least that humans at least are trying to make a difference. Maybe it doesn't work all the time, but damn it, you know what? I'd rather that we try to regulate something, as opposed to just simply say, well, the criminals are just going to get their hands on guns anyway. No? Even if you try to do something, that tells you something. The realists are like, oh, that's never going to happen. The liberals are like, give it a chance, man. At the risk of sounding cliche, give peace a chance. Because you know what? Sometimes it actually works.